So great. It's a real pleasure to be here. And James, I just caught the second part of your talk, but fascinating. Actually, a lot of the questions and issues you're flagging are ones that we're thinking about now, and particularly on the constraints. What's that link with primary healthcare? This optimism of surveillance versus the reality that actually, if could we spot something that, or let alone intervene effectively at an early stage? All those things are very live, and the issues around zoonosis, spillover, and so on. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't got any slides, I haven't got any equations, haven't got any data. So I hope it's a little bit of a break maybe from more technical discussions that you've had. Just to introduce myself. So I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor at FCDO. I'm seconded from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where basically I'm an epidemiologist, and my background's in mathematical modelling. So I have a real interest in trying to ensure that modelling is, the power of modelling is applied in lots of different ways to inform decision making, and that we do have this sort of healthy interaction between people who are on the inside of different policy making organisations being able to interact effectively with different modelling communities to say how do we learn, how do we understand each other's worlds and work together most effectively. Just to say, in terms of FCDO, I was the chief scientist at DFID before becoming the chief scientist at FCDO. So a lot of my sort of work and interactions with modelling in my policy environment has been very much in the development sphere, and things like Ebola responses, using modelling in different ways to think through different approaches to the different outbreaks, how big it might be, what might be the risk of cross-border spread, for example, on Ebola, or other things such as cholera prediction in different forms, thinking about vaccination strategy, volumes of vaccines we might need, as well as COVID, which is what I thought I would focus on mainly today. I think just to say, sort of reflecting back on the past few years and the various infectious disease outbreaks where we've tried to work very closely with modelling community, we're often very much struggling with that issue of sparsity of data, the behavioural elements being a huge unknown that influences, what may or may not play out depending on the kind of actions you might recommend or support. So I do think, it's very easy to focus on lessons from COVID, but actually probably a lot of the lessons also apply to other infectious diseases. Moving on to COVID. Just to say, so my role in the COVID response was twofold. So one was very much advising UK government on the international response, in particular, what is our response and the types of actions we should prioritise for developing countries. But also as a scientist in government, a CSA in government, quite rapidly got pulled into SAGE and supporting the domestic response as well, and actually it's in that forum that I got to meet many of the people here in the room, and really valued the breadth of inputs over sustained periods of times, and just how significant that contribution was for shaping our response, but also in the sort of syntheses of evidence and understanding how that also got picked up by many other countries. So as part of my job, often I was part of conversations with different countries who are similarly dealing with different variants, or what's that tension between lockdown and the economic pressures of that, and how you support sensible policy making. So often actually it was interesting to me how much they were reading SAGE papers, they were using that and saying, well, actually, this is how we're interpreting that sort of trade-off you're expressing in our own different country contexts. I think if I reflect back on the types of questions, clearly they evolved over the course of the pandemic from early on, sort of questions around understanding some of the key epidemiological parameters, trying to get a sense of, how much this might be a global threat versus something that could potentially be more localized. And what's interesting there for me, if I think about the modeling input, is in some ways it was very powerful to help us get a sense of some of the key parameters, the epidemiological parameters. But actually, in terms of influencing and sort of having the reality check, Lombardy was incredibly influential. Actually, when you see it close to home and going, okay, if it can happen there, it could happen here. So, it's to me, sometimes when you're writing your impact statement for ref or something like that, you're trying to home it down to it's this piece of brilliant work that I've done or my team's done, when often it's a kind of a combination of factors that and different types of information will influence different people in different ways. And that's the sort of complexity sometimes as a scientist in government of how do you bring that combination of information to the attention of a minister, and be able to communicate both what we know, but also what we're less certain on to them, and not get into writing policy, but just really helping understand what different sources of data might suggest. For me, what was interesting when I look internationally, one of the questions for us in some of the international response was quite basic early on about actually what might the impact look like in different country contexts where you might have different densities of population, different demographic structures, different competing tensions. You know, if you do a lockdown actually in a poor country, can people feed themselves? Can they actually have income to address their immediate needs? Your sort of trade-offs in policy decisions are very, very different to the sorts of trade-offs that might be considered across the different countries in the UK. The big questions we had linked to modelling in developing countries is how much are we missing? That was a really important one because we just knew the reliability of, the scale of testing is very limited core information. So for me personally, it just felt like often we were trying to think about responses with huge, not in all countries clearly, but in several countries, very, very limited data. And so often we were learning from the few countries that had strong surveillance systems, strong epidemiological capabilities. So South Africa, for example, really important in terms of helping understand how COVID is spreading in that particular range of geographies across South Africa, but also, us using that to think about what that might mean if you're in Zimbabwe, Zambia, other countries in the regions as well. In terms of my role domestically, at one point it just became the predominant action for me was just working in supporting some of the subgroup analyses for SAGE. So the things that I was sort of particularly involved in was some of the thinking around vulnerable groups, care homes in particular. I think Ian's speaking in a minute. And another one was around schools and youth populations essentially, and trying to really get a sense of how central those groups might be for overall transmission. And so how you think about implications of different approaches to schools. What was interesting for me there, in this sort of traditional SAGE model, the structures of SAGE, you have sort of NERVTAG, you have SPI-M, you have SPI-B, that was the behavioural group. They're relatively sort of sectoral in some ways in their design. What was nice about the task and finish groups that I was part of was actually they cut the cake in a slightly different way. So often you'd have modelers along with a behavioral scientist, along with somebody who's really thinking about some of the sort of what do we understand about the fundamental characteristics of a particular variant, coming together to say, what does this mean about what we can say about, for example, the extent to which keeping schools open or different levels of closure in different age groups and different geographies, how that might impact on transmission. And so I suppose if there's one lesson that came out for me quite early on was at one level that sort of sectoral view on, what does the combination of different models tell us about the overall, where is there consensus across the modeling community about a particular question, gives you one type of insight that's relevant for policy. But there's another one where actually you have that conversation across disciplines that sort of challenges, well, does your parameterization make sense? There is that, are kids really going to behave the way that sort of might be implied, or, what are your underlying assumptions around mixing patterns or whatever? That sort of cross-sectoral disciplinary challenge to me was quite rich. It meant often conversations were a bit more complicated. And sometimes coming to a consensus was harder, but for me, I think often added a richness to I think what the conclusions that we're able to draw from. And you know, Julia's sitting here nodding in the front because she was a very important part of those conversations along with others here. And actually from sort of modelers, for me, it was that sort of sticking with it and engaging with those behavioural scientists, with the others as well, was, I think, took quite a big commitment at time, given the pressures and other demands. But actually, you know, I'm sort of grateful that, because I think we did get richer insights. If I think about lessons, I think there's a few. I think there's one about, are we overlaying the different, when we're thinking about modelling to inform policy advice, are we overlaying the right sets of data? So, for example, early on in the COVID modelling, you know, we were looking at various trajectories around how big infection rate, how high infections rates might go, you know, what might be various estimates of the reproductive number. But it was only really when we started to look at what does that mean about risk of severe illness, hospitalization, acute admissions, and then saying what is the line that will tip the health system over, that actually the realities of the pressures and the size of that, of the waves that we were facing became real. And if you're thinking about analyses that then are useful for policy making, and particularly very big, significant policy questions, that sort of overlay of what does it mean directly? What does, you know, what are the tipping points? What are, that sort of element of the reality check linked to, look, here's a curve, here's your epidemic curve, it's very big, look, you were in the, whatever the numbers might be, and adding that interface and what this is what we can cope with, and this is what we really cannot cope with. To me, that was just such a powerful additional element that is quite a, in some respects, quite a simple addition, but in terms of the ability to communicate the significance and the need for action is really important. I think the second insight for me is, at times, and particularly in some groups, there was a major focus on trying to get more and more precise predictions of impact. But actually, when you were thinking about the range of policy options and levers, sometimes equally important is just using modelling to understand what are the key types of drivers that influence where it'll peak, how broad or sharp the curve might be, all of those things. So sometimes the more qualitative insights are as equally important as the quantitative. Now, I did my postdoc with Bob May, and he was very much of that. How do we understand that fundamental driver? So I might be biased in my perspective, because that's what, and it tends to be simpler mathematics as well. So maybe that's why I sort of gravitate to that. But actually, that's very useful if you're having a conversation with a minister, because you know it's this might be our sort of, you know, worrying less about the precise number and much more around let's help you understand the factors that are influencing that, and that what that might mean about, you know, their conclusions they might make about the choices they want to consider. I think that balance of the sort of qualitative and the quantitative is one that I think is worth to bear in mind. And I've seen it in the HIV world as well, where we, you know, I spent a lot of my academic career modeling HIV, and there, you know, there was a sort of real focus on let's get more and more precise predictions, but actually for policy making, what we needed was let's understand and unpick the drivers. And so some of the stuff, for example, that Julia, you did that I loved early on was getting into some of that fundamentals. And it just really helped you sort of pivot your mind into thinking about a problem in a different way, because it was sort of unpicking the different building blocks in a particular area where we had uncertainty. I think it was about variant emergence or something. I'm trying to remember what the example was. I think the third area to reflect on is sometimes, and often I think, the kind of policy choices that decision makers are having to make aren't solely within that infectious disease. It's what's the trade-off between this and economic impacts, or between COVID as a threat and other health impacts as a threat. And I think that's sometimes areas where we struggle to bring together potentially the power of modelling to enable us to explore some of those trade-offs a bit more explicitly. Within SAGE, there was some quite significant analysis to try and quantify the broader sort of health impacts of COVID and of the interventions. But if I look at the developing country space, it was often fairly piecemeal. And actually, I think in some cases, quite weak modeling analyses that were, you know, by various agencies with a particular interest in saying this is going to be the real area that's going to suffer, that were coming into the policy space versus, you know, quite nuanced, informed modeling. So to me, there was a sort of disparity between the intensity and detail of the COVID modeling with some of the other, some of the data that would have been useful to think about what are the options, what are the choices. And then lastly, I think what I think over time I saw Sage learn and sort of Chris and Patrick and others learn was just how you communicate findings. So there were sort of various graphics ultimately that were produced. There was this sort of watermelon type graphic that came up actually from different modeling groups trying something out to summarize so huge bodies of modeling that became really useful as tools to take into conversations with policymakers that were just really sort of summarizing the findings across a range of different parameter spaces to say, this is what it looks like if you're in this sort of space or another type of space. And I think over time, that graphics, that visualization, the levels of visualization and the kind of pointers of this is what it means in very accessible formats was also very useful. If there was thoughts about what to do differently, I think actually a lot was done brilliantly and amazingly and across, you know, a huge amount of input across many people. I think a lot was right from the start, and there was a lot of learning and a huge amount of commitment and good intention. I think, you know, looking forward, we need to pay attention to the models, you know, and have we got the models with the sort of intervention options and ability to model those? Are we thinking about the data sources, and that's both internationally and globally, and then also just continue to learn about visualization and communication, given how important that is to translating model findings into policy decisions. I'll end there.
Hi, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this kind of holistic approach, combining different disciplines and thinking, the way that I think about it is like, suppose the policymaker really is trying to address like general well-being made up by physical health, but also mental health, educational attainment, income, and on and on. And it seems like there are different ways that one could handle that. One that you described that I thought was super interesting was these task groups where people were challenging each other and asking questions about parameterizations. Another is to attempt to do some integrated modeling, which there's been some of. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about what you think about that. Is there an appetite for integrated modeling? Should we be trying to create the one great model, or do you like this more challenging interactive model better?
Yeah, I don't know, if I just think about the complexity of the modeling that we were asking modelers to do solely to model COVID, you know, and with the sort of geographic heterogeneity, the range of sort of intervention scenarios that were being considered, I slightly worry that if you go to a sort of multifaceted, multi-outcome model, you know, systems will fall over, or you will fall over, you know, sort of there's a bit of the sort of reality check at times on this, because even sort of modeling COVID, there was some various evolutions of what the models need to factor, be it variants, be it effects of vaccines, be it sort of different aspects of behavior. I think in an ideal world, yeah, you could kind of boil this down, you know, you could come to some sort of optimal sort of multifaceted sort of approach. My gut would be I'd worry about a lot of the data inputs. And so you would have huge margins across many different aspects of your input. And there's always this challenge, I think, as you get more and more different types of input, being able to see the wood for the trees. And then lastly, at one level, of course, governments care about all outcomes, but ultimately often the questions will come, there are questions around trade-offs, but there are also questions about, for example, very directed sectoral questions as well. Governments and services are organized by departments, so there will be different ministers, different political representatives making decisions about their sector. So I think it would be interesting to explore, but I think there will, I think I would be cautious about thinking that's inevitably the way forward. But I do think that healthy challenge and dialogue across is a good starting point.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm interested in the kind of policy and SAGE SPI-M interface, if you like. From your reflections, how much of it should policy choices be driven by modelling, and how much should modelling be driven by policy choices? Is it kind of a top-down, bottom-up, or what are your thoughts on that?
There's a few people in the room who could give a view on that. So essentially, early on, I think it was very much sort of describing, sort of in a way, descriptive epidemiology of what we might see. And then it started to think about what might be two things. One is what might be the impact on trajectories of different levels of behavior change, for example, or things like that. And then at some points there was also, can we get into more specific modeling of particular policy choices? I think if anything, that's when it became very difficult, just because the granularity of how that plays out with human behavior and all the factors becomes too complex. So that the sweet spot was that scenarios were being modeled, but it wasn't, it wasn't, this is a particular policy choices. These are how these different elements influence essentially what you'll see. And then the policy choice is separate to that. I think having a bit of an interaction of what are the variables that you play around with in the model is informed by sort of thinking about policy scenarios. But I think there was quite strong attempts to be going, the SPI-M, the modeling isn't giving policy answers. It's showing how different factors interact. And then policymakers going, okay, this is what it means about what I think our policy choice, our policy decision will be. But it was a bit of a, that balance is quite hard. And that's why I think ultimately some of the sort of representation of this is the parameter space, and this is what it looks like if you're in different parts of that parameter space, which relate to different policy choices, was quite a smart way of communicating quite complex information, epidemiological information and analyses in a way that didn't mean that SPI-M was making policy decisions. But clearly sort of modeling things that are completely unfeasible out of any kind of reasonable parameter space is no use at all. So you sort of need that conversation between the sort of technical people often in the departments with then the SPI-M and modelers. Charlotte's not able to stay. I just got here after missing, having problems just from London. So yeah, apologies for not being able to stay late.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Just interested in your perspective also from the FCDO perspective. So obviously pandemics, global influence. Do you think we were too introspective as a country with our response? Do you think what are your sort of reflections on how we looked at the international sphere and sort of how that affects us versus also how we can affect change in the international sphere? And maybe there are a sort of lessons learned for supporting resilience there that you could comment on, or many open questions in that sort of regard, beyond maybe just the data availability.
Yeah,
thanks.
I mean, it's sort of getting out of the modelling sphere, but I mean, from an FCDO perspective, we were heavily engaged in the international. And there was a range of elements to that. There was elements around working with WHO, supporting WHO, heavily leaning into, for example, supporting the establishment of COVAX, really thinking about other options to get essentially advanced purchase commitments to try and ensure that vaccines can be committed to developing countries. Now, there are clearly issues around the pace at which that happened, but actually some of those vehicles were not there at the start of the pandemic. And essentially those were developed through a range of international, very fast-paced action, where it was very much sort of FCDO as an active part of that, of trying to shape it, learn from other advanced purchase mechanisms to say, what does that look like, with the lead relationship with Gavi and other the key players, and so on, as well as investing in international research linked to diagnostics, vaccines and others, and then a range of bilateral support that different countries' offices were providing as well to try and support their response. So I think it was less visible, but a huge range of international activity happening at the same time, and that work still continues. So at the moment, heavy engagement in the pandemic treaty, a lot of sort of thinking about what is the future global health infrastructure that we need to be thinking about for future resilience. A lot of sort of interest in how do we get over optimistic of what will happen, but what are the key capabilities we need to be thinking about, and then how do you mobilize the resource and political commitment towards that? And coming out of G7, there are a lot of commitments. Clearly now there are a huge range of competing pressures as well.
Thanks, Charlotte. Perhaps with your FCDO hat still on, we've just heard James advocating for improved primary healthcare in developing nations, and through that increased surveillance. How do we do that while still not getting the South Africa effect, where they were first to spot Omicron, they were first to spot Beta, and yet on both occasions travel from them was blocked and having enormous knock-on effects?
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting, I think part of the pandemic treaty and some of the sort of international dialogue is trying to think about how do we learn from this. You don't want the country who's invested in the science capability to be penalized for that. And so there is an areas of, how do you think about readjusting the ways of working? I mean, we've also been working with others across Whitehall to also synthesize some of the learning and evidence sort of around, for example, the effectiveness of travel measures and how that varies by different levels of infectivity and how quickly or not we spot virus. So we're also trying to think about how do we dock in some of the learning from where we've got to now, so that if we get a new variant or a new disease, we aren't starting from scratch in some of the sort of response mechanisms that we might consider. So there's a bit of that aspect. I think sort of FCDO has always been hugely, in our health investments, a champion of primary healthcare, universal health coverage. I think what's interesting is COVID has increased attention on the importance of that capability. If I'm honest, I worry about, we should be doing that because it's the right thing to do. It's the right way to tackle poor health generally, and then what are the elements that you link to that around surveillance? To me, it's got to be that way. I worry about the ambition of the scale of surveillance, and I really want to take the slide, just that one on Ebola and the probability of actually seeing it, because there's a bit of a reality check of what does that mean then about what the options are that we consider? And I haven't got the answer to that, but I think, again, it's that sort of interaction of what might insights from modeling tell us about actually what might be realistic if you did strengthen healthcare versus actually what percentage you're going to miss anyway. And we need to be thinking about something else as a next step, a fallback action as well. Yeah, okay.